I think the thing that I most remember when I think of my first few days with Carol, called me into the office and she said, Marion, she said, you know, we're women. And it is important to realize that we have to be twice as good as men at anything we do. So you always have to be positive. You always have to do your very best because that's what it's about. We have to defend ourselves. It was really quite interesting because I thought to myself, you know, I never really thought about that before. And I took it to heart. And she said, you need to practice your lettering so you letter better. It was very funny. You have to know Carol to appreciate it. I always think of Carol basically as my mentor. I've always looked up to her as a role model. I went in to tell her I wanted to go to Harvard, that I'd been accepted. And she said, oh, dearie, you knew you were in trouble. She said, oh, dearie. She said, you know, that degree doesn't really do much. I said, well, you've got a degree from Harvard. And I said, I'm going to go for just 2 years. And she said, well, who's going to do your work while you're gone? I said, well, I thought I'd work part-time. And she said, that's good. And we settled on 30 hours a week. And so I literally worked 30 hours a week for Carol while I was at Harvard. And at any given moment, somebody could be running over from the office to tell me I had to come back and do something, or that I had to decide something, or that I needed to get in a meeting. And so it was a very interesting thing. I blazed a trail between 133 Mount Auburn Street and Harvard GSD. And a lot of the work that was in the office at that time was either public housing, Ben did Worcester housing, some public housing, or it was college campuses. She did a lot of campus work for Ben and for others. So her two biggest things were, they were not really the public as much as they were working for architects in the beginning. She wasn't going out and getting jobs as Carol Johnson landscape architect, going after public parks. That really happened later. In the very beginning, it was public housing and basically college work that we did. And then we did work on the Cambridge Common, I think was one of the first ones we did, where we actually started getting into public parks. And she's better known, I think, at this point for her work in public parks than she is in most anything. I think the thing that most of us remember about Carol is her adventures. First year that I was there, she went on a raft down the Amazon. That will give you an idea. One of the last trips she did while I was there was climbing in Tibet. So, I mean, she was a very much of an adventurous person. She every year did something like that, even if it was just going to Paris for a month or something. But she was always off on some kind of an adventure. I think in Boston, she really made women realize, I think, that they could have their own firms. And she had compatriots who were architects who were doing the same thing. She was the first firm that was a woman-owned firm, really, of any size in the Boston area. And she started to get a reputation. She started not only to do private work, like colleges and housing and things directly for architects, but by the time we were down at the other end of Mount Auburn Street, and even up at 133, we were doing public work. She moved into the point where she was going after public parks in various places. And I think that was really important. Actually, by the time I left, we were doing things in very many different places. Of course, John Marshall Park, which was one of the last projects I worked on, was in Washington, D.C. for the PADC. And we were then starting to actually move into doing things in other cities. We were not just a Boston firm anymore. And that's when she started to be known, I think, is when she started really getting into working in other cities. She just felt that, as I said in the very beginning, you have to do your best. You have to be better than any man who's doing the project, and you have to always be at the top of your game. And that was her philosophy and how she operated. And she was very, very tied into history, too, I should mention. When she worked on things, she was always concerned with historically what had been there before. She was also extremely involved with plants. She was always very much of a plants person. Planting plans were very important when they were being done. She oversaw really everything. On John Marshall Park, for instance, she looked at every little contour, every little plant, she was always totally involved in her projects.